old friends. Thanks for joining. So what I'm going to do today is share a little bit about my journey and relatively recent interest in how to bring the science that we do here at Scripps and elsewhere to the policymakers, especially at the international level. I was trained as really a basic scientist with no specific interest or even awareness of applied problems and of the kinds of decision making that we're now doing about the ocean. But over my 40 decades of doing science, it's become very clear the ocean has many, many challenges. It's been changing pretty rapidly, and scientists now really need to engage in helping to manage and conserve life in the ocean. So the topics I'm going to cover, a little bit about the deep sea for those people who are not familiar, the challenges and threats faced by deep sea ecosystems and the science that's needed to address these. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about international policy for biodiversity and climate and how that works and how scientists can contribute. So I'm going to start with the ocean. Most of the ocean is actually deep ocean, and as oceanographers, biological oceanographers, we define this as below 200 meters water depth. The deep ocean covers about 2/3 of the planet's surface. It's more than 95% of the habitable volume on this planet. We haven't mapped very much of the deep sea, less than 1/4 of the seafloor, but much less of the marine life. And as a result, most marine species remain undescribed. So, interest in the deep sea, of course, goes back a long ways. And 1,000 years ago, the perception of the deep sea was one of mystery and terror, with sea monsters that came up to consume and destroy seagoing sailors. So, people were afraid of it. About the mid-1850s, deep sea exploration began to be serious. There were ships and sampling of the deep sea, and the first 100 years of these explorations revealed what people thought was a cold, dark, salty, high-pressure environment that was covered with mud, that was pretty homogeneous and stable and quiet and food limited. So basically, people thought it was a desert without much life down there. But the last 60 years have seen a lot of different kinds of exploration and the new exploration tools being invented. And so now we can map the deep ocean bathymetry, the seafloor. We can map the acoustics and the chemical flares and animal migrations. We have submarines, we have remotely operated vehicles, we have autonomous underwater vehicles and camera sleds and all different kinds of instruments that have allowed us to view the deep sea and to learn more about it. And one of the things we've learned is it's not a single ecosystem. People tend to refer to it as the deep sea as if this was one thing. But it turns out, just like land is not one ecosystem, the deep ocean is not either. We've discovered large areas of low oxygen along our continental margins, sometimes covered with bacteria. We've discovered vast abyssal plains dominated by very tiny animals. We've discovered that there are tens of thousands of underwater volcanoes called seamounts with dense aggregations of life. There are hundreds or probably thousands of canyons and fjords cut into our margins. There are very, very deep trenches along the margins. There are chemosynthetic ecosystems, which rely on chemical energy rather than photosynthesis and sunlight. These include hydrothermal vents and methane seeps and even whale falls, although the whale provides the original food source and they rely on photosynthesis. And then we've discovered that even the biology, the cold water corals and sponges that live in the deep sea can make massive habitat areas that we consider to be reefs that support a wealth of biodiversity. All of these different ecosystems that we've discovered host specialized species, and many of them have extreme conditions. We call these extreme environments. And the animals that have evolved to live there literally have superpowers. So we have animals at hydrothermal vents that can live at extraordinarily high temperatures. We have animals that live at methane seeps and CO2 vents that can tolerate extremely low pHs, very acidic waters. We have animals at seeps that can tolerate high hydrogen sulfide, or animals in different regions that can live at super low oxygen levels. We have animals in trenches that can live at pressure 100 times what we live at. Even 1,000 times, actually, 1,000 times. And we have animals that can digest wood and whalebone through their symbionts. And my favorite superpower for the deep sea is the power of extreme longevity. The fish can live for hundreds of years, and some of the cold water corals and sponges can live for thousands of years. And the oldest known animal is about 17 or 18,000 years old. We've also discovered in this era of discovery that there are all sorts of interesting interactions and nursery grounds that are in the deep sea that we didn't know about. We've discovered that sponges provide habitat for juvenile rockfish, that deep sea pens provide habitat for fish larvae and amongst their stinging tentacles. We've discovered new octopus brooding grounds where there's slightly warmer water. We call these octopus gardens. We've discovered that our methane seepage areas and vents provide nursery grounds for skates and rays in the deep sea. And one of my favorite nursery habitats are these really strange agglutinated sediment animals they're not really animals, they're single-celled protozoans called xenophyophores down here on the lower right. They're literally, this is the size of your fist, but it's made of one cell and it sticks sediments into to make a home. And we've discovered that some snailfish lay their eggs down deep into the xenophyophores to protect them, presumably. And so we have a single-celled animal being a nursery habitat for a fish. We have come to learn that deep sea biodiversity provides a lot of services. There are new metabolites and drugs emerging from the deep sea produced by the organisms, new kinds of biomaterials, new anti-fouling and detoxification processes, cellulases and pyrulases used in industry. People have looked at deep sea tube worms as a source of artificial blood because it has such high oxygen affinity. And some of the microbes are really good at removing carbon dioxide. So people are investigating those capabilities. So there are a lot of potential services provided to humans and some that already are. But this biodiversity also is the material that allows life to adapt to change. And so conserving it's quite important. At the same time that we have discovered a host of different ecosystems, we've discovered that they have resources of interest to people. So oxygen minimum zone bacteria actually sequester phosphorus, and there's now interest in mining phosphorites from some of our continental margins. We've discovered minerals like cobalt, nickel, copper, and others can be found in polymetallic nodules on abyssal plains and in ferromanganese crusts on seamounts. And And there are some of these elements, along with gold and silver, appear at the massive sulfides precipitated at hydrothermal vents. And now there is interest in mining all of these minerals from the deep ocean. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. We've also discovered that there are aggregations of fish around seamounts that are harvested. For example, orange roughy or Chilean sea bass actually aggregate around methane seeps, and these are harvested in the southern hemisphere. We've come to understand that the deep sea provides a lot of important regulating services, both carbon sequestration and nutrient cycling. This happens through the biological pump, where carbon is taken up by phytoplankton at the surface. It aggregates and sinks into the deep sea, but deep sea animals also help move that carbon down into the ocean. And so we have the animal pump, the small particle pumps. We have animals burying carbon into deep sea sediments. We have whales falling down and bringing carbon. There's a lot of different types of contributions the deep sea makes to the carbon cycle. The deep ocean has also taken up a lot of the heat from climate change, and I'll come back to that. Now, let me go back and just say, these diagrams that you see here are typical representations of what happens in the ocean, but they all show the bottom of the ocean as featureless with no life. And that's not true at all. So all of these ecosystems that I've been describing to you play critical roles in carbon sequestration. The mesopelagic fish migrate downwards, transporting carbon vertically every day. Other habitats have really high rates of carbon sequestration along our margins. Some areas, like the vast abyssal plains, just hold so much of the planet's carbon because they're so large. Other systems have very high biomass of animals, and they hold carbon. And methane seeps carbon from emerging as methane from inside the Earth's crust is filtered and sequestered, sometimes converted to rock. And hydrothermal vents play a really important role in the carbon cycle, fertilizing the ocean, introducing nutrients that allow phytoplankton to take up carbon from the atmosphere. So those are regulating services. And I'll come back to climate change, but we have important cultural services. The deep sea is a site for scientific research and education, inspiration for films and literature and art. It hosts all our really important communication cables that allow the internet to be everywhere. And a little bit of tourism happens, but most people don't realize the deep sea also holds important spiritual values for indigenous peoples. There are different groups that believe their people originated in the deep sea, or that their ancestors reside in the deep sea, or that they are custodians of the deep ocean. So there are all these we've discovered a lot of life, a lot of biodiversity and ecosystem services provided by the deep ocean. At the same time, human populations are growing and beginning to affect the deep ocean. So as our population grows, we demand more food, more energy, more raw materials, and more metals and rare earth elements. And as we deplete these on land, we look to the ocean for them. And as we deplete these in shallow water, we've come to look to the deep ocean. And as a result, we are now more or less industrializing the deep ocean, creating many threats to biodiversity. Let's see if I can get this movie to play while I'm talking. This beautiful seamount from off Costa Rica. We have bottom trawling that damages the seafloor. We have oil and gas extraction in the deep sea routinely now, and often and sometimes associated with really damaging spills. We have the potential for deep seabed mining. It's not happening yet, but there's a lot of plans for it. We have all kinds of contamination running off land, along with spills and dumping that goes on in the deep sea. For example, these industrial waste production barrels off the coast of Los Angeles. We have plastics arriving in the deep sea, and we have mine tailings that are piped from land mining into the deep sea. So these are just some examples of the threats posed. And all of these can create disturbances of different types. Sometimes it's physical disruption of the seafloor. And it's important to realize when you dig up or trawl the seafloor, you actually release carbon that's been sequestered back into the water. It can create suspended sediments that can smother or clog animals. It changes the substrates and affects what can live there, changes food webs. Often our activities result in loss of three-dimensional structure that creates habitat, and so we lose biodiversity that way, and we alter the chemistry of the deep ocean. So those are kind of direct threats from either human extraction or waste disposal, but we also have threats to the deep ocean from climate change. The ocean is our greatest climate mitigator, and it's taken up 93% of the excess heat and introduced to the atmosphere through our emissions since the pre-industrial era. And that heat uptake is changing the solubility of gases and the stratification of the ocean and leading to oxygen loss in the ocean and decline in production by surface phytoplankton. And the ocean is also taking up carbon dioxide directly. It's taken up about a quarter of that, and that leads to a process we call ocean acidification that leads to declining ocean pH. And all of this happens at the surface of the ocean, but we have these massive thermohaline circulation, sometimes called the big conveyor belt, that moves the water from the surface into the deep sea. And this is leading to changes in the ocean, in deep ocean waters. And so as a result, we have the deep ocean warming. We don't often look at the effects on life, but we know that there are some. An important example is changes in tuna distributions. They're migrating eastward and they're moving into shallower water as the water warms. And well, actually, they're moving into shallower water as the waters lose oxygen. And so this is affecting the catchability of tuna. And also, they're such important sources of income for island nations. And as they move out of the island waters into international waters, that also affects the income for these nations. We have what's called ocean deoxygenation, the loss of oxygen as a result of warming, and this causes biodiversity loss in the ocean and compression of habitats and changing food webs. And ocean acidification threatens the animals that calcify, such as deepwater corals. It makes it harder for them to form their skeletons, and this means they need more food and more energy at the same time that food supplies declining from phytoplankton growth declining. And it also, ocean acidification will dissolve the non-living parts of the big reefs. In fact, most of cold-water coral reefs are non-living. So there are these threats from climate change, and it's important to realize that if we can tackle climate change and address this, that we will contribute to protecting biodiversity in the deep ocean. Now, this is a complicated chart. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it. It's a burning ember diagram produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from a special report on oceans and cryosphere in a changing climate. And the main thing I want to show you is that these are risk levels portrayed. The deeper the color, the more risk at different temperatures, and all the deep sea ecosystems are shown up in this red box up here. And most of them are not at a very high risk if we maintain warming at 1.5 degrees. But as soon as we go above that, we start to see the ecosystems being threatened at low to moderate risk, and some even at high risk if we continue on our current trajectory of warming. And there's another risk facing the deep ocean that most people don't realize, but with the urgency to tackle climate change, people now have created a number of different technologies that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and use the deep ocean as the dumping ground. And this very complicated diagram shows some of them: addition of ocean alkaline particles, fertilization of the ocean, artificial upwelling, crop waste disposal, and macroalgal cultivation and sinking. All of these are designed to remove carbon from the atmosphere or the surface waters and deposit it into deep water. There's also direct injection of CO2 into the water or subsurface. And all of these will have impacts both on the chemistry of the water column and the animals that live in deep ocean waters, and on the seafloor, in some cases smothering life on the seafloor and creating toxic conditions. And right now, environmental risk of these technologies has not been a very important part of the discussion. Mostly people are looking at many startups and many businesses at how they can implement these technologies. So we have a deep ocean that's stressed by climate change, that's stressed by resource extraction and waste, and by carbon. And many of these activities now threaten the carbon cycle services that we rely on to keep this planet stable. And it's important to realize that the properties of deep ocean life really determine their vulnerability to disturbances that I've been talking about and their ability to recover from them. So there's many different kinds of science that we need to understand, to assess their vulnerability and to help manage the deep sea. Species discovery is very important. As I mentioned, most species remain undiscovered. Understanding how long species live is important, as species can live a very long time, and this would make their recovery very slow, certainly not in our lifetimes. We are starting to understand that their distributions are not very broad, that there's a lot of endemism and high heterogeneity. We know that species rely on stable environmental conditions, and as they change, as these conditions change, they might not be able to adapt. We know that there are really strong species interactions among each other, and if you damage one species, that you might actually lose others as a result. And we know that deep sea ecosystems are really connected both to the surface and to each other across different ocean basins. So if you do something in one place, you might actually alter conditions in another place. So let's see where I am. I would like to turn now to the policy realm and talk a little bit about the deep ocean and who owns it and how it's managed and how scientists can interact with that management. So we have something that's like the Constitution for the Ocean called the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, and it has created jurisdictions that assign countries rights to waters up to 200 nautical miles from shore. And these are called exclusive economic zones. And all the areas you see in blue on this map, are exclusive economic zones. And 154 countries have these, anybody with a coastline. Some countries have claimed extended continental shelf beyond those zones to 350 miles offshore, and those are all the areas you see in red. And the other 60% of the ocean is in international waters. That's the tan area, and this includes both the seabed and the waters above. And I'm going to focus my discussion mainly on the international ocean because that's where I've been most involved in the policy realm. But it's important to point out that most of the ocean is deep ocean. That's true for international waters, but people might not realize that 75% of exclusive economic zones are also deep ocean. if anybody's interested and you have your phone, this QR code can take you to a really fun app that called Deep Sea and your EEZ, in which you can put your finger on a map on any country's exclusive economic zone and look at the depth breakdown for that exclusive economic zone. It's something we've been sharing in international fora. Okay, so how is this international ocean managed? Well, it's managed through this alphabet soup of conventions and bodies associated with the United Nations. And it's managed in a very siloed way in that there are different organizations to manage different things. So for example, biodiversity is managed in the ocean, international ocean, and the whole ocean actually. It's managed by the Convention on Biological Diversity and a new agreement that was just signed this year called the BBNJ agreement that I'll come back to and talk a little bit about. Climate is managed by the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Fisheries are managed by the Food and Agriculture Organization, and there are regional fisheries management organizations, as well as a few other conventions, like the one on migratory species and the regional seas conventions. Seabed mining in the international ocean is managed by the International Seabed Authority, set up by UNCLOS. Pollution is managed by the International Maritime Organization and what's called the London Convention and Protocol. Science is managed by the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission, and conservation. There are a couple of different commissions and conventions for managing endangered species and whales, for example. So they all operate more or less independently. But of course, there's only one ocean on this planet, and it's all interconnected, and all of these different themes are all interconnected as well. So I'm going to start with biodiversity. I don't know how many people are familiar with the fact that there was a new agreement that was signed this year on the conservation and sustainable use of marine biological diversity of areas beyond national jurisdiction. This is really a game changer. It's been discussed for almost 20 years now. It was negotiated over the last 5 years, signed this year, but it's not ratified. 60 nations have to ratify it before it goes into force. It has 4 major components. It addresses marine genetic resources in international waters and benefit sharing. It addresses conservation through area-based management, like marine protected areas. It requires environmental impact assessments for activities in the international ocean, and it has a big component of capacity building and the transfer of marine technology so that all nations can engage. I've been particularly interested in, although this is a biodiversity treaty, in building climate and seeing what can be done to help address climate change through this treaty, and actually working with a number of other influential people. We were able to get some language into the text of the treaty that acknowledges that biodiversity in the ocean underpins the carbon cycling services that we rely on in the international ocean. So there are a number of things that this agreement can actually do once it goes into force. It can help protect the ocean carbon cycle through the creation of marine protected areas and climate refugia and corridors and conservation of carbon services. And it can use environmental impact assessments to monitor effects on climate and require and look at some of the climate impacts, as well as the impacts of climate mitigation, like marine carbon dioxide removal. There's also the power to empower the potential to empower global engagement and capacity to address biodiversity and climate change together. So we can use our climate science that we have, such as climate projection models that tell us where climate change is going to be worse on the seafloor, or when climate change will emerge from background conditions in the deep sea, and we can use these to help prioritize areas to protect, or areas to monitor, or hazardous areas, areas where things might change. Another biodiversity agreement is the Convention on Biodiversity, and just last year, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was approved, and it has a target of conserving 30% of land, waters, and sea. Some of you may have heard of 30 by 30. They want to do this by 2030. Right now, only 8% of the ocean is in protected areas, and only 1.2% of the international ocean is in protected areas. And to achieve this 30% goal, the international ocean will have to be protected. And this is the BBNJ agreement should help with this. The Convention on Biological Diversity has developed through regional meetings ecologically and biologically significant areas that will probably be the precursor to protection of the deep sea environment in the international ocean. However, none of these really, except for one, have used climate change as a criterion. So I mentioned that climate policy occurs through the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and its science arm, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And this is where climate negotiations happen. You've probably heard of the annual COPs. It was in Dubai last year. I and my colleagues brought some policy briefs to Dubai to try to point out that climate policy needs to address biodiversity, just like biodiversity policy needs to address climate change. And there are a lot, and that by protecting biodiversity, we actually can protect the climate. And I'm not going to go through all of these different elements of the climate negotiations, but there are many different ways to build biodiversity protection into climate policy. And there's a real strong need to harmonize what the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change does in terms of climate policy with the BBNJ agreement. There's a big role for science and scientists in monitoring and assessing climate change and its impacts on biodiversity. And anything we can learn about the carbon cycle and the services it provides is going to be helpful in addressing climate change. And I think that I bring this up again because, let's see, I might have actually meant to, let me just skip this slide. I meant to talk about it here. One of the things that I took away from the climate negotiations in Dubai a month ago was that there's a rapidly emerging narrative that we have to act quickly, and this means dumping carbon dioxide into the deep sea. So the narrative of urgency is there, despite warnings by the London Convention that there is considerable risk to this. We know that there are threats to biodiversity, the carbon cycle, and ecosystem services from these different marine carbon dioxide removal technologies. It distracts from the discussion of emissions reductions. It's become really polarized, and there are many equity issues because of where people want to do this. And there's almost complete lack of scientific evidence right now for the efficacy of these technologies in actually removing carbon and keeping it out of the atmosphere for a long period. There are governance challenges. There's, I think, a question of motivation because companies are already selling carbon credits. And there's a lot of parallels to the goal of mining the seabed to produce metals. And I actually will talk about mining and fishing a little bit. So how am I on time? Yeah, a few more minutes. We are, in addition to climate, we are fishing in the deep sea, increasingly deeper so that it's routine to fish below 1,000 meters now. And this has led to overfishing of very long-lived fish that do not recover quickly. It's led to destruction of the bottom and loss of three-dimensional habitat. It's led to causing endangered species that aren't even targeted by the fishermen, but they're caught as bycatch, and to such a great extent that they're now considered endangered. And it's led to ghost fishing, which is what happens when gear sits all over the bottom and continues to collect fish, even though nobody's recovering them. So it can be very damaging. Deep sea fishing is managed at the international level by regional fisheries management organizations. You can see this map of deep sea fishing all over the world. It happens everywhere. These RFMOs are tasked with protecting vulnerable marine ecosystems, which are habitats like cold water coral and sponge reefs that are critical to the well-being of deep sea fish. They have a set of criteria, and the RFMOs are also supposed to prevent significant adverse impacts through impact assessment, which they have to do now for any new fisheries, such as the proposed deep sea mesopelagic fisheries, which would remove the billions of tiny fish that migrate up and down, presumably for fish feed, a fish meal, and fish oil for aquaculture. It hasn't started as a major industry, but there's been some pilot studies. The RFMOs also now have to take into account the potential impacts of climate change and ocean acidification, according to the UN General Assembly. So they're tasked with a tough job that really requires a lot of science. And they're just starting to look at how to manage deep sea fisheries under climate change. The Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative, a group I'll mention in a bit, that I helped to start, has worked with the FAO on a technical report and found basically that there are a number of species that are subject to both very high climate risk based on climate projections and also high fishing vulnerability. And these are taxa that particularly need protection. There's a group of people that have been looking at how to better identify vulnerable marine ecosystems, which are protected in the deep sea now from fishing, from bottom fishing. Up to this point, the FAO had to, or I should say the fishermen had to actually trawl them up before they were identified and protected. But now, for example, bringing up corals and sponges, but now there are new tools to use for identifying them from video. Let's see what else I want to say. We have scientists contribute seafloor habitat mapping and suitability models to help understand how the distributions of these VMEs will change. Another major looming activity is deep seabed mining, managed by the International Seabed Authority. The motivation is to get minerals like cobalt, nickel, and copper to help with the development of with the production of electric car batteries and all our electronics. The International Seabed Authority has let out 30 contracts for exploration of deep seabed mining in all the areas you see here. And 20 nations are involved, all the nations shown in blue, along with some island nations here. By far, the most nations are involved in this region, the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, where there are polymetallic nodules, but there's also interest in mining massive sulfides. And I guess I took the picture out of ferromanganese crusts. So deep seabed mining hasn't happened, but it's ramping up. There are some groups that would like to see it happen in the next year or two. There is a lot of science that has to go into the design of the protected areas, these green areas you see around the Clarion-Clipperton Zone. These are formed by regional environmental management plans. But there are a lot, and science goes into designing baseline studies and triggers and thresholds and cumulative effects and impacts on ecosystem services. And I would argue climate considerations have not really been a part of the design of any of this. But I just want to show you for the Clarion-Clipperton Zone that all the regions are subject to different amounts of climate hazard and different times when those climate hazards will emerge from natural background. That's what we call time of emergence. And so we can't really treat these areas as all equal. And I think that needs to be incorporated into management. So we're in a place where we have all these different activities happening in the deep sea. Many of them pose threats to biodiversity and to the integrity of deep sea ecosystems. They're managed by different UN agencies, all operating independently, and how to harmonize their activities is a big, big challenge. You can't really manage one part of the seafloor or one sector without influencing the other. Scientists, there's a big, big need for science. Most scientists don't realize that or how they can engage. Certainly, there are global assessments. You may have heard of the IPCC reports or the World Ocean Assessment or the IPBES reports on biodiversity and ecosystem services. And the UN also has a science body, GASAMP, that produces reports. They're, again, somewhat siloed. So one's on biodiversity and one's on climate, and this one on the ocean has some of everything, but it's not all well integrated into managing for societal needs. And so there's been a proposal to have a new international panel for ocean sustainability that brings all of these types of activities together. And the last slide, I think this is my last slide, I want to show is that there are a lot of different ways that we can advance and contribute deep sea science in service of, climate, tackling climate and addressing other societal needs. I've been talking a little bit about science diplomacy. There are science networks like the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative and the Deep Ocean Observing Strategy that I'm involved in that can actually bring science to policymakers. But there are other things we can do. Science, especially deep sea science, is not very equitable. It's very expensive, so it's mostly done by wealthy Northern Hemisphere countries. But there is now a move to develop low-cost technology, observing technology that becomes available to all, to offer leadership training and mentoring, especially for people from developing countries and the global south and places that don't currently really know much about their deep sea, making data more accessible and usable. It's called the FAIR principles, is a really important part of equitable access for all nations. Conducting independent research that's not tied to resource extraction is something that needs to be done increasingly in the deep sea. There is a need for financial support of various sorts. International partnerships are really important. There are a lot of different international instruments out there, as I've talked about, but they need to be harmonized. And also, even within scientific networks, we need to do more coordination of our different observing programs and bringing the different disciplines, physics, biology, and chemistry together. So that's a long list of things we need to do, but I think going forward, it can and should happen. So with that, I am happy to, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much.